Hello, welcome to the Path 11 podcast. I am your host, April Hanna. I am also the co-founder of Path 11 Productions, and aside from podcasting, we also make great films and documentaries, which can be found at path11productions.com. We have a special promo code just for our podcast listeners. The promo code is Path11Podcast, and if you go to our website, path11productions.com, and visit our shop page, put that promo code in, and you will receive 50% off of our Evolution DVD, which is the third film in our Path Trilogy series. If you would like to become a sponsor of the Path 11 podcast, please email me at info@path11productions.com. And now for this week's show. Today I am joined with Greg Marcus. Ph.D. is an innovator Mussar maven and the creator of American Mussar, a 21st century spiritual practice for an authentic and meaningful life. He is a graduate of the Mussar Institute's facilitator training program and has been practicing and teaching for 5 years. Greg offers guidance on how to lead a life of mindful harmony and spiritual integrity, drawing upon timeless Jewish teachings and contemporary wisdom alike. He has a Ph.D. from MIT and worked for 10 years as a marketer in Silicon Valley. He also is the founder of AmericanMussar.com. And his latest book is the one that we're going to be speaking about today, The Spiritual Practice of Good Actions, Finding Balance Through the Soul's Traits of Mussar, has been praised by rabbis, secular Jews, and people of all faiths for its inclusive and empowering introduction to this ancient wisdom. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you, April. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited. When I was reading your book, I learned a lot, about Mussar, and I had no idea in the beginning of the book. I'm like, what is he talking about? And then you later went on to describe it. So it's been a great teaching for me and what I found, and actually think that I'm probably going to be taking some of what you teach in the book into my mental health practice with some of my clients, because I think that there's some great teachings in the book as well. So I'd like you to begin in letting our listeners know how your life changed about 10 years ago.
Right. Well, about 10 years ago, at the time, I was a complete workaholic. Today I'm happy to say I'm a recovering workaholic, but I was working about 90 hours a week. And I thought I had like the ideal life, this great job, great family. And I loved the job so much that I put so much of myself into it. I ended up working 90 hours a week. And that changed when I became the scapegoat for a product launch that went bad. I was publicly humiliated by the president of the company. The next week, I went to a trade show and spent all day like tap dancing and telling customers how we were going to have everything fixed and everything was going to be taken care of. And then that night, my grandmother died. And I was so wrapped up in the work that I almost skipped her funeral, which would have been a horrible mistake. So it was in this state of mind that I went into Yom Kippur the following week, which is the holiest day of the year in Judaism. And like many Jews, I don't go to work. I go to services all day. I don't eat or drink anything for 24 hours. And we reflect on our life and try to think about what we've done wrong, who we need to make amends with. We try to repent and make resolutions for doing better in the following year. So with all of this going on, at 3 p.m, I was tired, I was woozy, I was sitting by myself, and they were chanting the Torah in Hebrew. And I looked down at the translation, and a couple of words jumped out at me. It said, "Don't turn to idols or molten things." And my first thought, I have to say, was really dismissive. I was thinking, oh my goodness, my life is falling apart, and we're starting in with this statues thing. I mean, what possible relevance could this have today? And then this phrase popped into my head, you need to do what's best for the company. And it was like a quiet voice that was talking to me. And when I heard it, my stomach clenched and my palms got sweaty. And I started thinking, well, what is a company? What is a corporation? It's this amorphous thing, and my mind started going through this whole chain of connections, and I realized that I had turned my employer into a false idol. And because doing what's best for the company, that's like one of these rationalization phrases that we used for canceling projects or asking people to work weekends. And doing what's best for the company isn't doing what's best. It wasn't what was best for me. It wasn't even what was best for the customers or the employees. And I decided that day I was going to realign myself with my values, with the values that I'd been raised with, and I was going to start putting people first, putting my health first, putting my family first. And within a year, I had cut my hours by a third without changing jobs. Nobody at work noticed, but my life at home became a real joy because I could be more present. I could spend time with them. And a year later, I cut my hours by a third again. And while I didn't realize it at the time, that day really set me on the spiritual path that took me to where I am today.
Yeah, one of the things that I really liked about your book, and I know that we'll get into it a little more in detail, is about just taking these small actions every single day. It's about these small steps that eventually lead to big changes. And one of the things that I really liked in the beginning is that you really allow the reader to reflect upon their own soul. And even on your website, you give people an opportunity to take a quiz about learning about their different soul traits. So I was wondering if you can also talk about that.
Sure. So if we think about, so there's two parts to what you're saying. One is, and that's very fundamental to Mussar practice, it's all about these small, gradual changes. That's the true path towards personal transformation. And I kind of discovered this by accident when I was cutting back my hours. So I would say, my health is more important. So I'm going to stop working at 9:30 so I can sleep. And then, my wife is important, so I'll stop working at 9. And then my kids are important, so I'll stop working at 8. And gradually over time, those added up to really big changes. So when I learned about Mussar and it started talking about, what Mussar teaches is that we are our souls. Like, we don't have a soul, we are a soul. But what the soul is something that's really hard to understand. People for thousands of years have been trying to figure this out. So what we do in Mussar is we look at what are called soul traits. And soul traits are things like humility, honor, trust, order, awe. And having too much of a soul trait is just as bad as having too little. So you tracking with me so far?
Yep.
Okay, great. So let's look at a soul trait like patience. Okay, well, if we have too little patience, we're angry, we're frustrated. But if we have too much patience, maybe we're staying in a bad job, we're staying in a bad relationship, we're not speaking up, we're not taking action when we should. And so what the soul trait quiz does is it gives you an opportunity to evaluate yourself. Where do you sit along the spectrum for 13 different soul traits? And then it creates like a little diagram, which gives you an idea of just like a little snapshot of where you think your soul is at this given point.
Yeah, and I'd like to read to the listeners those 13 traits, just so they have an idea, too, of what would be assessed during this. And the traits that you talk about, and in part 2 of your book, you go through each of these individually, is humility, patience, enthusiasm, trust, loving kindness, truth, honor, gratitude, order, silence, equanimity, fear of consequences, awe of majesty. So, and the other thing that you had made mention is that many times when we are doing a self-assessment for ourselves, we often rate ourselves a little bit higher than maybe our friends or family looking in on us would say. And you gave an example of somebody in the book about patience, where they were rating themselves as being very patient, showed their wife. It might have even been you that you were giving an example of, and they were like, "What are you talking about? You're not that patient."
Yeah, as humans, we are notoriously bad at self-assessment. There's a famous psychology study that was done where they asked people, if they were an above average driver. And 95% of people say that they're above average drivers. So obviously that can't be true. 50% have to be above average, 50% have to be below average. So we aren't necessarily good at assessing where we are. And one of the nice things about Mussar is, one is it's really nice if you have a community group so you can get some feedback from other people. But there are also stories and teachings from the literature that go back thousands of years, which give benchmarks and real examples. It's like, well, this is what balanced patience looks like, and this is how we're supposed to show up with enthusiasm for things, to kind of give us some benchmarks and some ideas about how we're supposed to act.
Also in the book, you talk about how we have 4 assumptions about the soul. And then from there, you move from assumptions into actions. So can you take our listeners through those 4 assumptions?
Yeah. So part of the reason why I created assumptions was it was from my background as a marketer, where we would create these financial forecasts. And the forecasts would only hold true if these assumptions were true. So, if it was like if I'm running a store, it might be, 100 people come in an hour and each person spends on average $10. So I'll make $1,000 an hour. So, Judaism is a religion with lots and lots of teachings. They go back thousands of years. And most people, whether you're Jewish or you're not Jewish, don't have a detailed education on that. So rather than have to learn that whole backstory, I created assumptions. And maybe you agree with them, maybe you don't, but if you assume that they're true and just see where that takes you, it allows you to show up in the practice. So what these 4 assumptions are 1, we all have a divine spark, but it's occluded by our baggage. 2, we have free will, but it's not always accessible. 3rd is we are driven by a conflict between the good inclination and the evil inclination. And 4 is we all have the same soul traits, but we have different amounts of each.
And that's part of the soul evaluation that you provide the readers and what you have on your website is, trying to find that balance, looking at the soul traits that you do have, maybe where the strengths are in certain, and then obviously trying to come back into that balance.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it gives like a very nice visual snapshot. And what you get is like a little spider diagram where you get these little spikes. And then in the middle, there's this dotted line. There's like a circle right in the middle. And that's sort of what represents our divine spark. So if your point for patience is way above the circle, then that says, okay, well, maybe I'm too patient. And if your point for truth is way below the circle, then maybe it's okay, I'm not truthful enough.
Yeah, and I really loved when you were writing about the divine spark and reading that. It reminded me a lot of what I've read in the teachings of A Course in Miracles. And they basically say the same thing, just different verbiage. But, they talk about shining the light from within, and that when you become that light and you're shining your light on your darkness, that the darkness doesn't have the ability to hide. And you kind of use the word spark and baggage. So can you talk to people about what is that divine spark that truly is in all of us, that ultimately I think somewhere along the line during our life path, we're all trying to find that spark, ignite it, grow it within ourselves so we can become more authentic to who we are?
Yeah, so you can look at this kind of, if you want to look kind of within me, and thank you for making that comparison with the divine miracles, because these ideas are present in many different traditions. I think that they're all sort of converging on kind of a similar truth. I mean, what within the Jewish tradition, and this holds in the other religions like Christianity and Islam, they say that Adam was created in the divine image. And it's not like a physical image. It's talking about that divine spark. We all have this point of goodness, of being, you can think of it, if you're not sure about the divinity, you can think of it as your best self. You can think of it as that universal spark of humanity that we all have, and that when that is in control and when we allow that to manifest, we show up as like an amazing person. But that's not all that we have. We also have our baggage. We have those hurts that have happened to us along the way, our disappointments, ways that we were raised, ways that we were socialized by the culture. And those tend to get in the way. And what Mussar does is it helps us move the bags and let that light shine through.
Yeah, and in talking about moving from the assumptions to the actions, I'd like us to take the listeners kind of as we travel through your book here about, how it's really about practicing those small actions in order to make the change within the inner world of yourself.
Right. So one of the things that's really cool about Mussar is you'll have like the rabbis laying out certain teachings where, some medieval rabbi will talk about, making changes is how you change your soul, and that's how you get lasting change. And then all of a sudden, here we are in the 21st century, in the late 20th century, where we look at neurobiology and we see that when we make changes, it rewires our brain and it creates new pathways and it leads to permanent change. So, we can all be like amazing people as we're kind of sitting at the kitchen table and talking about what you should do. But it's what happens in the real world that matters. It's how we show up and how we take action. And when we're working on a soul trait, what we'll do is we'll try to find one part of our life where we would like to make a change. Like again, going back to the patience example, if I'm a really impatient person, I'm not suddenly going to become the Dalai Lama and become this super patient person. But I can pick one part of my life where I'm going to make one change. One of my students, and I share this story in the book, she was a real rageaholic type driver. I mean, she was from the East Coast. I live in California. She was always yelling at other drivers. And so she said, so she told her family, I'm going to work on patience. And they all laughed at her and said, oh, good luck with that, Mom. And so what she said is, okay, I'm going to let every car in front of me. Every car that wants to merge, I'm just going to let them go in front of me. So she told this to our group, and she came back 2 weeks later. So, I am the most patient driver in California. Her drive was completely transformed. She just let people in. She started listening to the radio. She was humming along. She was relaxed and calm when she arrived home. And then she found herself becoming more patient in other parts of her life. So by just in 2 weeks making this one change, it was transformational and made a permanent change in her life. And so then after that 2 weeks, we would move on to a new soul trait, work on that for 2 weeks. And then after you've gone through all 13, you cycle back and return to the first. And each time you make you climb another rung in the ladder. You have another opportunity to make a second change in that soul trait. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And also kind of, when you also talked in the book how people, even after like the first class that they take or, the first time that they're starting to take those small actions, that change really can be very immediate with this practice.
It can. It's sort of amazing when we start to just allow a little bit of calm and taking an honest look at our life and realize that we can make choices. That assumption that we have free will, but it's not always accessible. I mean, sometimes we just react to things or we act out of habit without thinking about it. And when we're reacting or acting out of habit, we're not accessing our free will. But I had the very first class I took, we were talking about humility, or we were talking about humility, and all of a sudden one of the people said, okay, I'm going to show up differently in court. She was like going to small claims court the next day, and she had all these like traps set up for the other person. She's like, I don't need to do all that. I'm just going to lay out what happened and not try to like make the other person look bad or really be inflammatory. And suddenly her whole body calmed, and it was this was after 45 minutes. It was incredible. It was amazing. We all had tears in our eyes. It was wonderful to be a part of seeing someone experience that.
In reading this book too, what I find in the Mussar practice is one of the sayings, keep it simple. you know, and there's a simplicity about this that I feel makes it even that much more accessible. It doesn't feel, you know, when you're reading this book that it feels overwhelming. Where do I begin? How do I start? This seems like that this is going to be a long journey. And I think I remember reading somewhere that if the brain, when you set a goal, if the brain believes if that it's going to take more than 10 to 20% of effort, that usually that goal will fail, because the brain has to be able to assess that you can approach the goal and it can be completed and there could be some sort of success with only about 10% effort.
Wow, I'd never heard that before, but I love that. That totally makes sense to me. You know,
Yeah.
I say, like, people who I'm coaching or I'm working with, or I'll say, you know, you want to reach but not stretch. You know, it's like I used to like take yoga classes and I'd be like, okay, the more agony I inflict on myself, the better. And now it's like, no, that's not what we want to do. Body doesn't like agony. The mind doesn't like agony. It's about just getting a little bit of a comfortable reach. Just, you know, there's no growth in the comfort zone. So you have to do something, but taking one step is just fine. You don't need to try to leap the Grand Canyon.
Right. And the daily practice of this has three parts. There's meditation, mindful action, and journaling. And you also give an example, because many people will beat themselves up that they don't have a meditation practice. I know Deepak Chopra always says that if you say you don't have time to meditate, then you need to meditate like 20 extra minutes a day, you know, but people in this world are always trying to find the time. And in your book, you make it very simple and you say, just do 2 minutes, and maybe you'll always stay at 2 minutes. Maybe you'll decide that your meditation practice will grow. But, you know, again, you give that very simple step. And like you said, everybody can find 2 minutes. And that's what made me think about that one quote that I had read about, like the brain needing that goal to feel very small, of only having to exert that 10% of effort in order to be a success. And, you know, 2 minutes, you're just asking me for 2 minutes of my day. That feels very doable.
Yeah, and we try to make it even easier too, because often we're meditating on like a particular phrase. So we've been talking about patience a lot. So there's different focus phrases or mantras that you can use. The one that I like is, this too shall pass, and I have the strength to get by until it does. And the reason why we say that is because patience is really about being able to endure an uncomfortable situation. You know, if you don't get mad in traffic, you don't need patience. But if it drives you crazy, then that's where you need to invoke patience to kind of help reduce the suffering you're going through and to help you get through it. So you would write that phrase on like a sticky note or an index card, and put it maybe in your bathroom so you see it when you first get up in the morning, or some people put it on their bed table. Or I have little mantra cards that you can buy with these, you know, with nice little designs to see it. And then you see that and you say, okay, and you just grab it, you read it out loud for 2 minutes, and by doing that, though, you frame your whole day. Like now you're sort of primed so that I'm going through my day and I'm looking around, it's like, oh, hey, I'm getting impatient right now. Oh boy, I am just kind of sitting here and taking it, and not saying anything and not doing anything. And that's not good. I need to be a little less patient. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And I was kind of wondering if you wouldn't mind maybe bringing us through what the daily practice would look like for the trait of silence, because I feel like we live in a very loud world.
Yeah.
And how to be silent is, I think, a challenge with all of the stimulation that we have now. So if you were to use silence as an example, and I can kind of scroll through the book here. I have it on PDF, but I know that in the part 2 of the book, you know, for our listeners, in going through, Greg goes through all of these 13 traits and does give you an example of a mantra that you can use and examples of how to journal. So, Greg, I don't know if you have the mantra for silence memorized, but if you do, I'd like you to take us through what silence would look like through somebody's day if they're working on that trait.
Right. So if I remember correctly, I believe the mantra I use is, nothing is better than silence. Is that correct?
If you give me a couple of minutes, I might be able to get there.
Oh, okay. Well, let's assume it's nothing is better than silence. That's
Okay.
one of the mantras. That's a really good one. And silence is really, and that's a great thing to pick because it covers two things. It covers when to speak and not to speak, and it also has to do with internal silence. And so many of us, we get so overstimulated over stressful jobs or family situations or dating situations or whatever it might be, and then our mind is racing all the time. So silence is internal silence, and it's also when to speak and not to speak. You know, the world, you know, the Torah, the Bible teaches that the world was created through speech. And when we speak, we are assisting the divine in that ongoing act of creation. So when you speak up or when you don't has an incredible impact on the world. So I would start the day with this 2 minutes of chanting or reading or speaking the mantra. So I might say, nothing is better than silence. 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 Or I might create a little tune. Nothing is better than silence. But anyway, you know, I'd kind of do my thing. And then as I go through the day, I would think about, okay, well, what is an area where I want to bring more silence? And one of my students, what she decided to do was she was going to leave the radio off in the car. And she described, after doing this for a few days, she noticed it was a really sunny day, and so she was driving on the neighborhood streets, and she rolled down the windows, and suddenly she could hear, you know, like birds singing, and she could just hear the wind, and she could hear the leaves blowing around. And she just felt, you know, this calm and this peace because she chose to just unplug from the radio while she was driving. And we do these practices for 2 weeks at a time so that if a practice is a little bit uncomfortable, we know that we don't need to continue it. But by sticking with it, it really gives the soul an opportunity to adjust. And then at night, what we do is then we write about it in our journal. So you would say, I decided to turn off the radio, and as I was listening, I heard the wind, and that was really cool. Or, you know, I decided to speak out a little bit in a meeting. Usually I'm silent and just sit there ruminating on all the things I said, and I asked a question. I decided to speak. Or might share something that you didn't do so well. It's like, oh, you know, someone started going on, and I just interrupted them and spoke over them, and I should have stayed silent and been more polite. So that's kind of what a day of Mussar practice would look like.
And then the journaling aspect. So when people practice it during their day, what would be the journaling component at night?
So at night, you would write down like how the soul trait came up. So how was silence challenged for me during the day? Or what opportunities did I have for silence? And you would write about that. And it could just be a couple of sentences. It might be paragraphs. And journaling is hard for a lot of people. Some people are natural journalers. Others weren't. I was not a journaler until I started Mussar, and it took me a little while to get going. But it really helps. It really helps kind of cement and seal in and notice and witness the changes that are taking place and the challenges that remain.
And you also mentioned that Mussar is about moving beyond your comfort zone. So when we're speaking about silence, what would you recommend for those introverts who are like, ooh, this one's going to be an easy one for me. I can be very silent, both internally and, you know, in my external world, but you actually would push people who maybe do practice more of silence to speak out. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, so that goes back to this idea that having too much of a soul trait can be just as bad as having too little. So if you're too silent, you are missing an opportunity to kind of make the world a better place and to help other people with your wisdom and knowledge. And so for someone who is very introverted, for them the challenge might be to speak out more. It might be to initiate a conversation with an old friend who you haven't seen in a while. Maybe if you're in like the corporate world or something and you're in a meeting and you're the person who never talks, well, you're in that meeting for a reason. You're there because they invited you because you have something to contribute. So for you, the challenge might be to ask one question. And if you're too introverted or too shy to ask the question in front of other people, maybe for you, the starting point is go up to someone after the meeting and ask the question one-on-one. But by taking that step outside the comfort zone, we bring our soul towards balance.
Great, thank you. And I probably should have asked this question more in the beginning, and forgive me if I didn't, but I'd also like you to give just a little more background. You mentioned what Mussar is, but it's based in the religion of Judaism. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And how exactly, what's the story behind that? Like, how did Mussar come to be and then come to be this teaching?
Right. So there have been threads of Mussar within Judaism for thousands of years. And the basic, it's been almost like a countercultural thing where there's been some people who have said, hey, you just need to learn all the rules and regulations. And the other people that say, hey, you need to go beyond that and do acts of kindness and go beyond the letter of the law to the spirit of the law. And it really started about 1,000 years ago with a book called Duties of the Heart, which was written in the 11th century in Spain. And I have a copy of it on my shelf. And I think it's just, personally, I think it is so cool that there is a book that was written hundreds of years before the printing press was invented, that we are still reading and is still relevant today. And in the introduction, he says, hey, look, there's some people who become rabbis who are kind of the teachers and leaders within Judaism. And they do that because it gives them a lot of status in the community. And they'll study for 25 years, but they'll never once look in the mirror and look at their own conduct. And I wanted a book, and this is what he said, I wanted to write a book that said, hey, how do we become kind of really exemplary, saintly people? The modern word is this Yiddish word mensch. It's a person of outstanding character. Maybe if you've seen Seinfeld or heard the word. And so we all have what it takes to be a mensch, to be this person of outstanding character, but we just need some lessons. We need a manual. And that's what Mussar helps us do. So, and then in the last 1,000 years, there have been various Mussar masters who've continued to write on this topic.
Great, thank you. And now I'd like you to let our listeners know about the AmericanMussar.com and your website. You have events. This is where people can go on and take the quiz. They can sign up for your email list. You also have a curriculum for parenting, which is interesting too. So can you talk a little bit about your website and how you're doing your teachings of this?
Yeah, so I founded the website about 2 years ago. And I really wanted to make Mussar accessible. I wanted it to be available to the broader Jewish community and the non-Jewish community, people who don't necessarily have a lot of Jewish literacy, or they don't know Hebrew or are not comfortable with Hebrew. And so my focus was to really take these teachings and to present like what might be an old teaching, like side by side with a modern example, so that it's something that people can relate and implement in their own lives. So I have a blog, I have the quiz, which is a really nice entry to kind of get to know about your own spiritual journey. There are mantra cards that people can get. There are book recommendations. And about a year ago, I turned my Mussar practice towards parenting because I had 2 teenage daughters, and they can be a little challenging at times. Wonderful girls, but I was kind of pulling my hair out. And so I said, okay, I need some help. I need a little help here. So the best way for me to do that was by creating some materials and creating a class for this. Because that's how this book came from. It started with a class, and then after 3 years of the class, I wrote the book. So I said, well, let me see if I could do the same thing for parenting. And then with the curriculum, what I did is I took the class that I'd been teaching, which was picking out the most parent-relevant parts of the book, and then I wrote some notes so that anyone with just a couple of hours of training could start leading a Mussar group for parents.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This was really informative. I really like the simplicity of it. Like I said, it just makes it just feel that you could really, like you said, just kind of stretch, reach, take all this information in, and it's those small little actions for people to take and to be mindful of. I think every time, the mindfulness aspect of what we do on a daily basis always seems to be very transformative for me. When if people buy certain, books that's like a 40-day course, and, you usually have teachers like yourself that are giving people a mantra to carry throughout your day really does change. It's very transformative when you are more mindful as you go about your day.
It really makes a difference. I was reading a book, and they were talking about doing the dishes, and I hate doing the dishes. And I said, well, just take your full attention to it and notice the warm water, and they, it can kind of become a much more pleasant activity. And it's like, oh wow, these dishes are clean now, and it can transform what's really mundane. Could be like an act of drudgery, or it could be something which is kind of cool and interesting.
Yeah, I also think that this would be a great book for a book club, for a group of people to get together. I mean, my mind as being a teacher, it goes to a 13-week course, that could be taught. And, each week you have the group or a book club just working on the first trait, then going to the second week, working on the second trait, maybe, obviously, like you said, once you cycle through the 13, you start from the beginning again, because I can also see where people, might be a little hard on themselves if they've worked on, the humility, the patience, the enthusiasm, then maybe they get to the trust, and then they realize in that day that they're trusting, but they're a little less patient. It's like, oh, darn, I'm working on trust, but I really wasn't patient in the moment. So I really see how, if you're cycling through these 13 traits and building upon them and going back, that, it makes sense how it would begin to balance out a little bit more for people if you're practicing it thoroughly.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. And that's something, a lot of the times there is crossover and things like that. And also by cycling through, we kind of get away from that bias, with a person who said, I'm really patient. Well, no, actually, you're not really patient. And if you just pick and chose which ones you were going to work on, maybe you'd skip one that was really, really important to you. And sometimes you think, oh, I'm really bad at something. And then you start to practice it and you realize you're actually really good at it.
Right.
And, so by going through all of them, you learn so much. You learn so much about yourself, and you learn just new wrinkles on things that Rabbi Eli Lopian said that Mussar is teaching the heart what the head already understands. So a lot of these concepts are really new, but how we actually do that, like everybody knows, oh, I should be generous, but how do you become generous? That's a totally different story. Doesn't do any good to beat yourself up and say, God, I really got to be more generous in giving. It doesn't work. But
yeah, it's bringing these traits more into your being. Like you said, there's one thing to know them, but it's another thing to be them.
Yes, exactly.
Well, thank you so much, Greg, for a wonderful interview. And let our listeners know the easiest way to get a hold of this book.
Right. So probably the easiest way to get the book is just to go to Amazon.com and search for The Spiritual Practice of Good Actions or Greg Marcus, and you'll find the book and order it. But you can also get it in many bookstores. Many libraries also carry it.
Great. And we'll be sure to put those links in our show notes. Well, thanks for spending this time with us, Greg, and much luck to all that you're doing, and thank you so much for enlightening us today.
You're very welcome, April. It was a lot of fun to be here.
If you want more information about our films, visit our website, path11productions.com, to purchase DVDs or to rent and stream each film. You can also find our trilogy of films on iTunes, Amazon Prime, and Gaia.com. You can still use our smartphone app for both Android and iPhones. Just search for Path 11 in the Google Play App Store, or if on an iPhone, look for Path 11 in the iOS App Store. Catch you next time.